Chapter 7. The Mohammedan menace, the rise of Islam's Saracens. Turks, the rapid rise and widespread conquest of Mohammedanism, make one of the most startling phenomena of history. If its story excites our wonder in these days, while we are watching its decadence, we may imagine the consternation wrought when its swarming hosts, with the prestige of having conquered all Western Asia, were breaking through the barriers of Christendom. We shall greatly mistake this movement if we regard it as a mere eruption of brute force, such as characterized the assaults of the barbarians upon the Roman Empire. The teachings of Mohammed, gross as they appear, in contrast with either primitive or modern Christianity, contained elements which appealed to far nobler sentiments than those entertained by the pagans of northern Europe, or those current in the age of the Prophet among the people of his own race. Compared with these, Islamism was a reformation, and enthused its adherents with the belief that they fought for the advancement of civilization, as well as for the rewards of paradise. The central thought of Islamism is the unity of the Godhead, and its first victory was the obliteration of polytheism among the tribes of Arabia. It is true that before the time of Mohammed, Allah had been accorded the first place in the speculative theology of the Arabs, yet gods many usurped their worship and were supposed to control their daily lives. Wise men, called Hanifs, had protested against the prevailing superstition and succeeded in spreading a healthful skepticism regarding the lesser divinities. Mohammed eagerly imbibed the better philosophy, familiarity with the religion of the Jews, and some acquaintance with the doctrine of Jesus, whom he accepted as a true prophet, doubtless gave shape and vividness to his better faith. His meditations on the grand themes of religion were, to his excited imagination, rewarded by definite revelation. He rose inspired with the conviction which became the call for a new civilization in the Orient. Great is God, and Muhammad is his prophet. Islam, or resignation to the sovereign will of Allah, became the title and spirit of the new religion. But if a celestial ray had touched and stimulated the mind of Mohammed, no heavenly influence refined his heart and conscience. Sensuality and cruelty, racial qualities of the Arab, were not only unrestrained, but utilized as agencies for the spread of the faith. Ferocity wielded the sword, and its fury was to be rewarded by the gratification of lust in a paradise whose description surpassed the sensuous fancies of pagan poets and romancers. The spirit of the new propaganda is evinced in this sentence from the Quran: the sword is the key of heaven and hell. A drop of blood shed in the cause of Allah, a night spent in arms, is of more avail than 2 months of fasting and prayer. Whoever falls in battle, his sins are forgiven, and at the day of judgment his limbs shall be supplied with the wings of angels and cherubim. It might seem that the Christian would be spared the vengeance of Muhammad, since he also taught the unity of the Godhead, but the Arabian misunderstood Christianity. To him the Trinity was essential polytheism. It must be confessed that such Christianity as the Arab saw very naturally suggested that false interpretation of the Bible doctrine. In some Eastern Christian sects, Mariolatry had exalted the mother of Jesus to the third place in the Trinity, horrid usurpation of the office of the Holy Ghost. The Quran expressly condemns the triform worship of Jehovah, Jesus, and Mary. The prophet, while denying the divinity of Christ, regarded himself as an avenger of Jesus, the holy man, against the heresy of his professed followers. Muhammad's last utterance is reported to have been, "The Lord destroy the Jews and Christians. Let his anger be kindled against all those that turn the tombs of their prophets into places of worship. Eternity in paradise." Oh, not only was the doctrine of the Quran acceptable to the people to whom it was delivered, the organization of the Mohammedan system provided an efficient agency for its development and propagandism. This organization was exceedingly simple. It had but one code for things religious and things secular. The Quran was at once the confession of faith and the national constitution. From the same pages, the priest preached eternal life. Caliph, Emir, and Sheikh quoted the rules of government. The judge drew his decision in controversies. The soldier read his reward for valor and death on the field, and merchant and peasant found the regulations for their daily traffic. The one book destroyed the distinction between sacred and profane, since everything became thereby religious, while the duties and amenities of common life were surcharged with the bigotry of devoteeism. The unity of Moslemism under the book was further intensified by the sole headship of the Prophet and his successors. The fondest dream of the popes of Rome, heresy, to blend spiritual and secular authority, was surpassed by the throne which actually arose in the Arabian desert. The opinion of the Caliph was the final decision of all questions of dogma. Ministers of state were his personal commissioners, and over them, as over the humblest subject, he exercised the power of life and death. One will was sovereign, responsible to none other, and actuated all things in church and state. One man's word rallied tribes and sects, and hurled them en masse upon his enemies, or, in more peaceful ways, directed their seeming diversities to the accomplishment of a single purpose. It must be acknowledged, however, that while the Mohammedan system thus adapted it to the most deadly tyranny over thought and life, it was not always so wielded. The cause was advanced by the sagacity, if not the more humane inclinations, of many of the caliphs. Not a few of these were among the wisest men of their day, and adopted a policy of leniency in dealing with their submissive enemies, which facilitated the extension of their rule. The repetition of a single sentence, acknowledging the unity of God and the supremacy of the prophet, transformed foe into friend. In many instances, the tribute paid to the conqueror was far less than that which the former Christian rulers had been in the habit of exacting, though, as a rule, Christian churches were ruthlessly despoiled of their symbolic ornaments and reduced to the barren simplicity of the mosque. Yet they were frequently spared this sacrilege when Jerusalem fell into the hands of Omar. The Christians were forbidden to call to worship by the sound of bell, to parade the streets in religious procession, to distinguish their sect by badge or dress, and were compelled to give up the temple site for the mosque of Omar. Yet they were allowed freely to worship in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Caliph himself refusing to appear within those sacred precincts, saying, "Had I done so, future Mussulmans would infringe the treaty under cover of imitating my example." Harun al-Rashid, in exchanging courtesies with Charlemagne, presented him with the keys of the Holy Sepulchre. To this compact unity of Mohammedanism under Koran and Caliph, and this wise blending of the terror of arms with peaceful patronage, thus do the unparalleled progress of the religion of the Prophet. The Moslem conquests will appear in the story, first of the Saracen and later that of the Turk. The Saracens, during Muhammad's lifetime, Arabia and Syria were beneath his hand. Within 8 years following, Persia, parts of Asia Minor, Palestine, and Egypt submitted to him. 13 years more, 653, Saul, the scimitar of the Saracens, enclosing an area as large as the Roman Empire under the Caesars. In 668, they assaulted Constantinople. Dort, in 77, North Africa surrendered the treasures of its entire coast from the Nile to the Atlantic, and the home of Augustine, the father of Christian orthodoxy, was occupied by the infidels. In 711, the Saracen general Tariq crossed the straits between the Mediterranean and Atlantic and landed on the rock which has ever since borne his name, Jebel Tariq, the Hill of Tariq, or Gibraltar. By 717, Spain, from the Mediterranean to the Pyrenees, had become the proud conquest of the Moors, but for the timely victory of Charles Martel at Tours in 732, they had surely subdued France and soon completed the circle of conquest by the desolation of Italy, Germany, and the lands bordering the Balkans. In 847, the Saracens were masters of Sicily and besieged Rome itself, plundering the suburban churches of St. Peter and St. Paul. 30 years later, Pope John wrote to Charles the Bold, "If all the trees in the forests were turned into tongues, they could not describe the ravages of these impious pagans. The devout people of God is destroyed by a continual slaughter. He who escapes the fire and the sword is carried as a captive into exile. Cities, castles, and villages are utterly wasted and without an inhabitant. The Hagganids have crossed the Tiber. In 916, these persistent foes occupied a fortress on the Gangliano between Naples and Rome, whence they held the papal domain at their mercy, and, seizing the persons of pilgrims on their way to the shrine of the apostles, held them for heavy ransom. This stronghold was broken up only by the attack of a powerful confederacy of Italian dukes, aided by the emperors of the East and West. The exigency was so great that, in the estimate of papal apologists, it warranted the action of Pope John, who arrayed himself in carnal armor and rode at the head of the attacking forces. In 1016, a powerful armament of Saracens was landed at Luna, in the territory of Pisa, but defeated by Pope Benedict. This disaster did not diminish either the hauteur or expectancy of the invader, who sent to the Pope a huge bag of chestnuts with the message, "I will return with as many valiant Saracens to the conquest of Italy." The Pope was not to be outdone in prowess of speech. and returned a bag of millet with the boast, "As many brave warriors as there are grains will appear at my bidding to defend their native land." In 1058 there occurred a wild outburst of Moslem bigotry which sent a thrill of horror through Christian Europe. The charity of earlier rulers of Palestine towards Christian worshippers gave place to fiercest persecution by Mad Hakem, the Sultan of Egypt, who razed to the ground the church of the Holy Sepulchre and slaughtered its devotees. He ultimately, however, commuted his rage into cupidity and affixed a tax upon the worshippers. At the close of the 11th century, the time of the First Crusade, the Saracenic power, though steadily receding before the Christians, still menaced southern Europe. Trained bands of Muslims, when not in war, on their own account with their common enemy, Christians, joined themselves with one or another of the contending parties which rent the empire and the church. Chaos in 1085, 10 years before the First Crusade, Pope Gregory rescued Rome from the hands of his imperial opponent, Henry of Germany, only with the assistance of Saracen soldiers who thronged the ranks of the Pope's Norman allies. Very naturally, the joy of the papal victory was mingled with jealousy of the means by which it had been accomplished. Not only were Moslem warriors often found in Christian ranks, frequently the valor of the Christian knight found freest exploit in the cause of the Moors. The adventures of the Air, whom Philip wished Rome to canonize as an ideal saint, were for 8 years performed in the service of the Arab king of Saragossa. The Moslem became also the rival of the Christian in commerce. The ships which in the lull of hostilities sailed from the ports of France and Italy met the richly laden vessels of Egypt and Spain in exhausting competition for the trade of the Mediterranean. The coast of North Africa was the lurking place of pirates, who darted over the great sea with the celerity of spiders along their web, and seized every craft that weakness or misfortune made their prey. With his wealth, the Moslem often won his way to social position, and even invaded the family relations of his Christian neighbour. Shakespeare's Othello, the Moor of Venice, if not a real character, was at least one typical not only of the 15th, but of earlier centuries. The plot of this play was borrowed by the English dramatist from the Venetian romances. More than one Desdemona had braved the curses of her Christian kindred for the fascinations of the infidel. Many a renegade Iago was found in his service, and often the Christian dignitary, like Brabantis, was led by gold and political advantage to assent that his daughter should run from her guardage to the sooty bosom of the Moor. Yet these misalliances did not destroy the common sentiment of the Christians against the Saracens. The foul sensuality allowed by the Koran, as it thus touched the homes of Europe, deepened the racial antipathy of the people who were still monogamic in their faith and customs. The Mohammedan menace was further augmented in the superstitious notions of the age by the intellectual ascendancy of the Saracens. Christendom did not discern that, in the mass of evils brought upon Europe by the invasions from the East, there were the germs of its own quickening, as the freshets of the Nile enriched the land of Egypt. If, in the first heat of his zealotry, the Saracen destroyed the library of Alexandria, regarding the Koran as compensation for all the books of Christian and pagan wisdom. Yet, in the light of the flames, he saw his mistake and became the most liberal patron of education. To the mosque he added the school, while the rest of Europe was in the density of the Dark Ages. The Moorish universities of Spain were the beacons of the revival of learning. The Christian teacher was still manipulating the bones of the saints when the Arab physician was making a materia medica and practicing surgery. By the discovery of strong acids, the Moor laid the basis of the science of chemistry. By the adoption of the Hindu numerals, he improved arithmetic. He first practically used, if he did not invent, algebra, introduced astronomy to the European student, wrote on optics, the weight and height of the atmosphere, gravity, capillary attraction, applied the pendulum to the measurement of time, and guessed that the earth was round. In the superstition of Christian Europe, these studies were regarded, if not as belonging to the magic arts, at least as threatening the faith by fostering undue independence of thought and tempting to skepticism regarding the office of the Church as universal teacher. The subsequent persecution of Galileo and Bruno was anticipated in the hatred and fear which were awakened by such names as Ben Musa, 9th century, Avicenna, 10th century, Al-Hasan and Al-Ghazali, in Fafruntu Ilm al-Shatshir. The diverse spirits of the age are illustrated by the Giralda, the Tower of Seville, which was built by the Moors for an observatory, but on the Catholic conquest was used only for a belfry. The Turks, the Saracenic conquests caused only a part of the Mohammedan menace in the 11th century. A new power appeared, which has since dominated the Middle Orient. For generations, the Turks, or Tartars, had been steadily pressing southward and westward, from Turkestan and the borders of China towards the fertile plains and rich cities of the Eastern Roman Empire. Of nomadic habits, their entire property was in their camps and the driven herds that sustained them. They were skilled horsemen, cradled in the saddle, tireless on the march, loving the swift foray better than luxurious residence, inured to danger and careless of blood. In the course of their migrations, they came in contact with the followers of Mohammed. The Koran, with its celestial endorsement of sensuality, easily captivated in such a people that demand of common human nature for some religious faith and pursuit. They became the most enthusiastic devotees of the new faith, although in their deeper passion for selfish conquest, they often slaughtered their fellow religionists of other races. Early in the 11th century, one division of this people, the Seljukian Turks, so named from their great chieftain Seljuk, overran Armenia and conquered Persia. Tughrul Beg, the grandson of Seljuk, had been elected to the chieftaincy according to the ancient custom, the chance drawing by the hand of a child of an arrow inscribed with his name. Or he was further honored by being chosen a temporal vicar of the Caliph of Baghdad, then the chief of Arabic Mohammedanism, Qutb al-Shah. In 1055, Tughrul Beg was proclaimed commander of the faithful and protector of Mussulmans. He was clothed in the 7 robes of honor, thus presented with 7 slaves born in the 7 climates of Araby, the blessed, thus crowned with 2 crowns and girded with 2 scimitars, emblematic of dominion over both the west and the east. The successor of Tughril Beg was Alp Arslan, the strong lion, 1063. He merited his title when, like a wild beast, he ravaged Armenia and Iberia, and then sprang upon Asia Minor. At the time, this peninsula between the Mediterranean and the Euxine was flourishing with proud cities and prolific fields, and occupied by an industrious, peace-loving population. The ruined amphitheatre and aqueduct, which today oppress the curiosity of the traveller, are the footprints of this Turkish invader, which the misgovernment of his successors has not permitted to be effaced. In the Battle of Manzikert, 1071, Alp Arslan defeated and captured Romanus, the Greek emperor, and thus broke the only Eastern power that could dispute his sway. Finlay remarks, history records few periods in which so large a portion of the human race was in so short a time reduced from an industrious and flourishing condition to degradation and serfage. Under Malek Shah, son of Alp Arslan, 1073, the Turkish power, swollen by new hordes from the great central plains of Asia, occupied almost the entire territory now known as Turkey in Asia. They pressed to the walls of Constantinople by threatening and by intrigue with every insurgent against the throne. They kept the Greek Empire in constant alarm. In their peril, the Greeks appealed for help to their Christian brethren of Europe, in spite of the scorn in which the Latins held the Greek Church for its antipapal heresies. The common danger led Pope Gregory Hildebrand in 1074 to summon all Christian potentates to repel the Turks. He himself proposed to lead the avenging hosts, but was diverted from this generous purpose by the nearer ambition of crushing the enemies of the papal throne at home. 1079, the Emperor Michael saved his crown only by the assistance of the Turks against his Greek rival, for which aid he paid by surrendering to Solomon the government of the best part of the empire east of the Bosporus. In 1093, Europe was startled by the news of the fall of Jerusalem, after incredible slaughter, not only of Christians, but of Arabic Muslims as well. The black flag of Ortuk floated from the Tower of David. All privileges which had been granted to followers of Jesus by the comparative humanity of the Arab were now withdrawn by the Turk. To bow in worship at the Holy Sepulchre was to bend the neck beneath the scimitar. Europe was thrown into a state of terrorism. Muslim irruption into the West seemed imminent. Kings trembled on their thrones, and peasant mothers hushed their crying babes with stories which transformed every spectre into the shape of the turbaned invader. In 1093, on the death of Malek Shah, the Turkish power was weakened by divisions. This gave Christendom heart. The statesmen at the Vatican saw the opportunity, and Pope Urban's appeal for the Crusades met the quick response both of the powers and the people. One of the divisions of Malek Shah's empire was that of Suleiman, Sultan of Rum or Iconium. From this power sprang the Ottomans, who for 800 years have held an unbroken dynasty, and for 400 years have occupied the city of Constantine for their capital. Chapter 8, Pilgrimages Origin and growth of the custom, extent. Old Testament religion made much of sacred places. In the early occupancy of Palestine, Hebron, Bethel, Shiloh, and Shechem were the resorts of the faithful. In later ages, Jerusalem became the shrine, whither the tribes went up by divine command. For this localized devotion, there was an evident reason in the purpose of providence to localize a peculiar people for religious training, such as they could not obtain if scattered among the nations. The sacredness was not in the site, but in its living associations, as the rendezvous of wise and holy men. Christianity had no such necessity, and reversed this narrower policy with our Lord's command, "Go ye into all the world, and preach the gospel to every creature." Therefore, in the ruling of providence, the places most closely associated with the life of the Son of God were either unknown, as a spot of the temptation in the wilderness and the mountain where he retired for prayer, or these spots were left unmarked by the first disciples, as a high mountain on which he was transfigured, the room of the Last Supper, the site of the crucifixion, and of the tomb which witnessed his resurrection. This was a commentary of providence on Jesus' words, "The hour cometh, when ye shall neither in this mountain, nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father, ning tashti iu per desigo and tomaki nord, when the true worshippers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth." This relic of the Jewish custom, together with the universal pagan practice of venerating shrines and consulting local oracles, became an ever-pressing temptation to the early Christian church. It was difficult for either Jewish or heathen converts not to regard the land trodden by the feet of Jesus as peculiarly a holy land, and not to imagine that the celestial interest that once centered upon the scenes of his death and resurrection made heaven always to hang lowest over these spots. There was nothing in the teaching or practice of the apostles and early fathers of the church to suggest or approve these notions. They were willing exiles from the home of the faith. Unlike the patriarch Joseph, they gave no commandment concerning their bones being interred in the dust of Palestine. The conversion of Constantine to Christianity may have been genuine, but it did not completely exorcise the paganism to which he had been habituated. The pilgrimage of his mother, Helena, to Palestine, the alleged identification of sacred sites and relics by miraculous agencies, and their adornment with lavish magnificence, were the natural efflorescence of the hybrid religion that sprang up. Multitudes imitated the example of emperors and princes in the show of devotion. The new glory which Constantine gave to Jerusalem engaged their reverence, as his new capital on the Bosporus gratified their pride. St. Jerome, though 345, 420, wrote to Paulinus, "The court of heaven is as open in Britain as at Jerusalem." Nevertheless, the saint took up his abode in the church of the Nativity at Bethlehem. Paula, his companion, wrote, "Here the foremost of the world are gathered together." St. Augustine, 354, 430, oppressed by the fact that the beauty of the heavenly city was shadowed by men's reverence for the earthly Jerusalem, wrote, "He take no thought for long voyages. It is not by ship, but by love, that we go to him who is everywhere." But the enthusiasm for pilgrimage could be checked neither by the voice of saint nor by common sense, from the depths of the German forests, from the banks of the Seine and the bleak shores of Britain, as well as from the cities of southern Europe, poured the incessant streams of humanity to bathe in the waters of the Jordan where their Lord was baptized, or perchance to die at the tomb which witnessed his resurrection. As early as the 4th century, itineraries were published to guide the feet of the pious across the countries of Europe and Asia Minor. Hospitals were also established along the road, the support of which by those who stayed at home was regarded as specially meritorious in the sight of heaven. In 611 Chosroes, the Persian and Zoroastrian captured Jerusalem, slaughtered 90,000 Christian residents and pilgrims, and, more lamentable in the estimate of that age, carried off the wood of the true cross. But Heraclius, the Greek emperor, Shaul, after a 10 years' war, triumphed over the Persian power. Neither conquered lands nor the spoils of princely tents compared in stirring enthusiasm with the recapture of this relic. With great pomp, the emperor left a part of the cross to glorify his capital, Constantinople. On September 14, 629, Heraclius entered Jerusalem, bearing, like Simon the Cyrenian, the remainder of the sacred beams upon his back. With bare feet and in ragged garments, he traversed the city and re-erected the symbol of the world's faith upon the assumed site of Calvary. This event is still commemorated throughout the Roman Catholic world by the annual festival of the exaltation of the Holy Cross. Marvelous stories, the innocent exaggerations of weak minds, or the designed invention of unconscionable shrewdness, fed the credulity of the people. Bishop Arculf told of having seen the 3 tabernacles still standing upon the Mount of Transfiguration. Bernard of Brittany, as an eyewitness, described the angel who came from heaven each Easter morn to light the lamp above the Holy Sepulchre. At the opening of the 9th century, the friendship of Harun al-Rashid, king of Persia, for Charlemagne extended the privileges of pilgrims. The keys of the sepulchre of Jesus were sent by him as a royal gift to the Emperor of the West. Charlemagne's capitularies contain references to alms sent to Jerusalem to repair the churches of God, and to provide lodging with fire and water to pilgrims en route. The cruel persecution by Mad Hakem, the Caliph of Egypt, made scarcely an eddy in the current of humanity moving eastward. Counts and dukes vied with prelates in the multitude of their companions. In 1054, the Bishop of Cambrai started with a band of 3,000 fellow pilgrims. In 1064, the Archbishop of Mayence followed with 10,000, nearly half of whom perished by the way in the latter part of the 11th century. As has been related, the strong hand of the Turk first effectually checked the pilgrims. The horrors of the atrocities perpetrated by this new Mohammedan power afflicted Europe less than the cessation of the popular movement. The evil was twofold. Secular and spiritual, pilgrimage was often a lucrative business, as well as a pious performance. In the intervals of his visits to the sacred places, the European sojourner plied his calling as a tradesman. The Franks held a market before the Church of St. Mary. The Venetians, Genoese, and Pisans had stores in Jerusalem and the coast cities of Phoenicia. The courtiers of Europe, dressed in the rich stuffs sent from Asia, and drank the wine of Gaza. A great traffic was done in relics. The pilgrim returned, having in his wallet the credited bones of martyrs, bits of stone from sacred sites, ballow splinters from furniture, and shreds of garments made holy by association with the saints. These were sold to the wealthy and to churches, and their value augmented from year to year by reason of the fables which grew about them. In more generous minds, the passion for pilgrimage was fed by the desire for increased knowledge. Travel was the only compensation for the lack of books. One became measurably learned by visiting, while going to and returning from Palestine. Such cities as Constantinople or Alexandria, to say nothing of the enlightening intercourse with one's fellow Europeans while passing through their lands. Mere love of change and adventure also led many to take the staff. If, in our advanced civilization, men cannot entirely divest themselves of the nomadic habit, lamp and tourist are everywhere, we need not be surprised at the numbers of those who indulged this passion in days when home life was exceedingly monotonous, and its entertainment as meagre. But the chief incentive to pilgrimage was doubtless the supposed merit of treading the very footprints of our Lord. Not only was forgiveness of sins secured by kneeling on the site of Calvary, but to die en route was to fall in the open gateway of heaven, one's travel-soiled shirt becoming a shroud which would honor the hands of angels convoying the redeemed soul to the blissful abodes. Great criminals thus penanced their crimes. Frotmond, the murderer, his brow marked with ashes, and his clothes cut after the fashion of a winding sheet, tramped the streets of Jerusalem, the desert of Arabia, and homeward along the North African coast, only to be commanded by Pope Benedict XIII to repeat his penance on even a larger scale, after which he was received as a saint. Fulques of Anjou, who had brought his brother to death in a dungeon, found that 3 such journeys were necessary to wear away the guilt mark from his conscience. Robert of Normandy, the father of William the Conqueror, as penance for crime, walked barefoot the entire distance, accompanied by many knights and barons. When Sentius assaulted Pope Hildebrand, the pontiff uttered these words: "The injuries against myself I freely pardon. Thy sins against God, against his mother, his apostles, and his whole church must be expiated. Go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem." We are thus prepared to appreciate the incentive to the Crusades which men of all classes found in the speech of Pope Urban at Clermont, in inaugurating the movement, taking then the road to Jerusalem for the remission of sins, and depart assured of the imperishable glory which awaits you in the kingdom of heaven. Othman, the founder of the Ottoman dynasty of Turks, once had a dream in which he saw all the leaves of the world-shading tree, shaped like scimitars, and turning their points towards Constantinople. This he interpreted into a prophecy and command for the capture of that city. Similarly, we may conceive the various conditions and sentiments of Europe in the 11th century, which have been described in our previous chapters as directing the way to Jerusalem. Subsequent events, however, prove that, unlike Othman's leaves, the Christian incentives to the Crusades were not directed by the breath of heaven. Chapter 9. The Story of the Crusades. The summons Peter the Hermit, Pope Urban, popular excitement. It has been customary to attribute the actual initiation of the Crusades to the fiery eloquence of Peter the Hermit. This man was a native of Picardy, and was possessed of a spirit as restless as the seas that washed the shores of that northern province of France. He, at one time, seems to have followed the life of a soldier, but his ardent mind demanded higher entertainment than the gossip of camps and exploits of the field. The pursuit of letters, in an age so barren of literary sources, soon wearied him. Ecclesiastical duties seemed also a dreary routine. Like many of the nobler spirits of his day, he deserted the world, and in the seclusion of his own thoughts sought communion with heaven. His mind, unfurnished with information of the actual world, filled itself with visions. From ecstatic solitude he emerged at times to sway the masses with the eloquence of a second John the Baptist. According to tradition, he made the pilgrimage to Palestine, the sight of whose holy places inflamed his spiritual zeal, while the atrocities perpetrated upon his fellow Christians by the Turks rent his heart. Together with Simeon, the venerable patriarch of Jerusalem, he wept over the desolation of Zion. He there conceived the sublime purpose of rousing all Europe to take up arms against the common enemy. One day, while praying before the Holy Sepulchre, he heard the voice of Christ saying, "Peter, arise, hasten to proclaim the tribulations of my people." Bearing a letter from the Patriarch Nostuclei, he went to Rome and summoned Pope Urban II as the vicegerent of Jesus to listen to this new evangel from the ascended Lord. Urban perceived in the monk's fervour the signs of the will of heaven, and commissioned him to proclaim it to the nations of Europe. Magic Melash, it is unfortunate for the romance of this part of Peter's life that it is unconfirmed by any contemporary records. Anakomnena, the Greek annalist who lived in Peter's day, declares that while he started upon the pilgrimage, he did not reach Jerusalem. It is best to regard Peter's career as having been inspired by the crusading project already determined upon by others. His eloquence was like the first rush of steam from a newly opened volcano. It could not have generated the mighty force that upheaved Europe and hurled it against Asia. But there can be no doubt of the personality of Peter and of his tremendous influence in exciting the populace to engage in the Crusades after they were decreed in the councils of Rome. His labours in the great cause seem to have been limited to certain districts of France, for it is scarcely credible that a man of strange language could have thrown the spell of his rhapsodies over people living beyond the Rhine. Peter the Hermit was of small stature. He, with long beard, prematurely whitened by the rigours of his life, for he was not yet 50 years of age, with deep and penetrating eyes, fired by the enthusiasm that filled his soul. He travelled from place to place with uncovered head and bare feet, mounted upon a mule. The churches proving too small, the people thronged about him in the marketplaces and fields, where they drank from his lips worth for the Moslem. Pity for the Christian martyrs, whose blood he painted as flowing in the streets of Jerusalem, and hope of eternal reward if they should take the cross and sword. In the frenzy of speaking, he wept, wounded his own flesh with the violence of his gesticulation, and exhausted his physical strength in the rhapsody of speech, as he called upon the saints in heaven and the inanimate rock of Calvary to cry out against the apathy of the Christian world. The people were readily persuaded and attributed the response of their own passion, already inflamed by alarming events, to the preacher's miraculous gifts. They pressed about him that they might receive some heavenly grace from touching his person, and preserved as sacred relics the hairs they pulled from the tail of his mule. Very opportunely, there arrived at Rome in the year 1095 an embassy from Alexius, the Greek emperor, at Constantinople, begging assistance against the Turks, who were threatening the shores of the Bosporus. In his fright, or in the disingenuous diplomacy for which the Greeks were noted, Alexius offered to reward the Western warriors with the treasure of his capital, and even suggested that the empire they saved from the Mussulman might one day become the prize of the Latin. Urban summoned a synod at Piacenza, where the Greek messengers addressed in the open fields the crowd of ecclesiastics and laymen, which was so vast that neither the plazas nor churches of the city could contain them. A second council, more imposing on account of the dignitaries present, held at Clermont in November of the same year. In his speech, Urban wrought the assembly to a fury of enthusiasm as he cried, "Exterminate this vile race, Turks and Arabs, from the land ruled by our brethren. Haste, it is Christ who commands, if any lose your lives on the journey by land or sea, or in fighting against the heathen, their sins shall be remitted in that hour. This I grant through the power of God vested in me. Let those who have hitherto been robbers now become soldiers. Let those who have formerly been mercenaries at low wages now gain eternal rewards. Let those who have been exhausting themselves to the detriment both of body and soul now strive for a twofold reward on earth and in heaven." This impassioned appeal was answered by the cry of bishop and lord and knight, and was re-echoed by the assembled populace. "Deus vult, Deus vult. God wills it, Deus vult. Let that be your watch cry," responded the pontiff. All ranks and conditions of men thronged to receive the cross, if possible, from the hands of the Holy Father himself. This was a strip of red cloth, given with the assuring words, "Wear it upon your shoulders and your breasts. It will be either the surety of victory or the palm of martyrdom." All priests throughout Europe were authorized to give the sacred symbol with the full papal benediction to the people in their parishes. Many, in their infatuation, burned the cross mark into their quivering flesh. Others, grown insane through zealotry, imagined the stigmata. As these signs were called to have been produced by miraculous process, an impostor was readily credited with having received the mark on his forehead by the hand of an angel, and confessed the fraud. Nay, but not until after he had been invested with the archbishopric of Caesarea in Palestine. Preachers of the Holy War went everywhere over Western Europe. The enthusiasm passed like a forest fire. During the winter of 1095, there seemed to be but one occupation of men in palace, monastery, and cottage throughout northern France and along the lower Rhine, that of preparing arms and enrolling bands for the mighty exodus, which should take place as soon as the roads became passable in the spring. The rich sold or mortgaged their estates to raise the means of fitting out themselves and their retainers. Knights and esquires drilled incessantly for feats of arms against a foe whom they honoured for his rumoured prowess in fight as much as they detested him for impiety. Recluses left their religious retreats, their minds overwrought with anticipations of miracles to be performed, as in old Bible days, when waters divided and city walls fell down at the approach of God's people. Robbers emerged from their hiding places, or were delivered from jails, that they might expiate the crimes already committed against their fellow Christians by atrocities to be practiced upon the unbeliever. Doubtless, many were influenced by a genuine religious emotion, as the proclamation of the crusade was accompanied by the preaching of the terrors of the Lord against the prevalent sins of the people. To the persuasion of Peter the Hermit, many of the most notorious sinners attributed their reformation. Young men who were inclined to the monastic habit to escape the temptations of the world were easily led to substitute the helmet for the cowl, as offering a life more congenial to youthful enterprise, and at the same time more acceptable to God. Multitudes of the ignorant were animated by the new and popular enthusiasm without understanding its motive, and were drawn as by a freshet into the common channel, that no one might be deterred by domestic anxieties from engaging in the crusades. The Church guaranteed the protection of the families and property of absentees, and that no one might be tempted in the subsidence of the first fervour to reconsider his purpose. Excommunication was threatened on those who did not fulfill their vows. Thus Western Europe, in the spring of 1096, was not unlike a beehive, on the outside of which the insects are gathered preparatory to swarming. Ibert, a contemporary, says, although the French alone had heard the preaching of the crusade, what Christian people did not supply soldiers as well? You might have seen the Scotch, who represented to the continental mind the ends of the earth, covered with shaggy cloaks, hastened from the heart of their marshes. I take God to witness that there landed in our ports barbarians from nations I wist not of. No one understood their tongues, but placing their fingers in the form of a cross, they made sign that they desired to proceed to the defence of the Christian faith. The flight of these swarms of humanity eastward had 3 consecutive features which should be noted. First, it was a crusade of the crowd, which began in March 1096. Secondly, came the more orderly military movement under the great feudal chieftains, which began in the subsequent autumn. And thirdly, the enterprise became consolidated on national lines under the kings, who gradually acquired power and took command of their various peoples. This last feature, however, did not appear until the Second Crusade, nearly half a century later.